Case file 304 presents a physiological contradiction that defies standard medical categorization. The monitor displayed a flat line, indicating total cortical silence, yet the metabolic decay typically associated with brain death was entirely absent. The patient, a saturation diver retrieved from a catastrophic failure at depth, wasn't dying. He was suspended. Standard medical protocol identified a corpse. The forensic data suggested a system in a holding pattern. This case exposes the critical gap between institutional medicine and technical physics. The hospital failed because they treated a biology adapted for 30 atmospheres with surface-level protocols. They didn't understand that the silence wasn't an end, it was a frequency mismatch. To understand the magnitude of the failure, you must first analyze the environment. The Neuro ICU at St. Jude's is a monument to sterility, a space designed for absolute sensory minimization. Acoustic dampening tiles, hushed alarms, regulated airflow, and the soft rhythmic compression of the ventilator. For a standard trauma patient, this reduced stimulus is recovery. For Marcus Vance, it was a sensory vacuum. Vance was not a civilian. He was a saturation specialist, a biological machine calibrated for the crushing weight of the North Sea. For 20 years, his baseline reality existed at 30 atmospheres of pressure, breathing a heliox mixture, surrounded by the mechanical thrum of life support umbilicals and the groaning metal of a pressurized habitat. The medical team treated the symptoms of a coma, viewing the patient through the lens of surface trauma. They saw a lack of response to external stimuli and diagnosed a vegetative state. But they failed to account for the calibration of the receiver. When you bring a deep-sea organism to the surface too fast, the biology doesn't just bend, it locks. The nitrogen and helium saturation in the tissues creates a new neurological normal. Vance wasn't in a standard coma. He was in an atmospheric lock. His neural pathways had likely hardened against the low-pressure environment of the hospital room, effectively shutting down to preserve core integrity. Over 6 months, the attending team ran the standard pharmacological playbook. They initiated cortical stimulation protocols, firing electrical impulses into the frontal lobe to jumpstart activity. The data showed no uptake. They administered high-dose wakefulness agents, modafinil, amantadine, bromocriptine, flooding the system with stimulants designed to force synaptic firing. The toxicology reports indicated perfect absorption, yet the neurological effect was null. The drugs were present, but the geometry of the receptors had likely shifted. In the high-pressure environment of saturation diving, cell membranes become more rigid. At surface pressure, without the clamping force of the ocean, Vance's neurology was disorganized, unable to bind with the chemical signals. The doctors saw resistance. A physicist would have seen a phase mismatch. The frustration in the medical logs is palpable. The nurses noted that Vance's heart rate was impossibly steady, a flat 40 beats per minute, unyielding regardless of the time of day or invasive procedures. A pinch test, a sternal rub, a catheter change, the autonomic response remained flat. The institutional narrative began to solidify. The lights were on, but the building was condemned. They saw a biological shell kept animate by machines, unaware that the patient's physiology was likely perceiving the low-pressure silence of the room as a catastrophic system failure, forcing a protective shutdown. Enter Dr. Eris Halloway, the chief of neurology. Halloway operates on probability and established protocol. His assessment of case 304 was technically accurate based on surface medicine parameters. He saw 6 months of non-responsive stagnation. He saw resources being drained into a subject with a Glasgow coma scale of 3. In his audit, he noted that further intervention is medically futile. He wasn't being cruel, he was being efficient. The system cannot support anomalies indefinitely. Halloway's report was a masterpiece of administrative finality. He cited the ethical imperative of quality of life, arguing that maintaining Vance was a violation of dignity. He viewed the body as a failing asset. The decision to terminate care was not emotional. It was a calculation of resource allocation versus probable outcome. The probability was 0. Therefore, the outcome was termination. The order was drafted on a Tuesday. compassionate extubation. They would remove the feeding tube and the ventilator support, allowing the cardiac rhythm to finally follow the cortical silence. The logic was sound. The paperwork was signed, but the hospital's liability insurance required a final, obscure step for industrial accident cases: an external file review. This bureaucratic redundancy wasn't meant to save the patient. It was meant to clear the legal department. Yet, this single line of fine print in the hospital charter triggered a mandatory consultation with a specialist in occupational trauma. It was a box-checking exercise that accidentally opened the door to a different kind of physics. Dr. Elias Thorne is an anomaly in the medical register. Stripped of his clinical privileges 3 years prior for unauthorized experimental protocols, he exists now in the gray zone of hyperbaric forensics. He is the man the insurance companies call when a rig diver dies and the physics don't add up. He doesn't look for malpractice. He looks for mechanical failure in the biological system. When he arrived at St. Jude's, he didn't wear a white coat. He wore the oil-stained fatigue of a technician who understands that the human body is just another pressure vessel subject to the laws of thermodynamics. He bypassed the introductions. While Holloway attempted to summarize the 6-month stagnation of the patient, Thorne ignored him. He didn't approach the bed. He approached the life support stack. He ran a hand over the ventilator housing, feeling the vibration of the compressor. He looked at the acoustic dampening tiles on the ceiling with disdain. To a man who understands the deep ocean, absolute silence is not peace. Absolute silence is the signature of a severed communication line. He noted the ambient noise level of the room, 35 decibels, a whisper. For a man like Marcus Vance, whose brain had adapted to the deafening, bone-conducting roar of a saturation habitat, this room wasn't quiet. It was sensory deprivation. Thorne's eyes finally moved to the patient, but not to his face. He focused on the left hand, resting motionless on the sterile sheet. He watched it for 3 minutes. The nurses shifted uncomfortably. Holloway checked his watch. Then, the building's central HVAC unit cycled on, a low-frequency shudder that vibrated through the floorboards. At that exact moment, Vance's index finger twitched. It wasn't a spasm. It was a rhythmic tapping. Thorne checked the monitor. The heart rate hadn't moved. The cortical spikes were absent. But the finger was moving in perfect sync with the 60-cycle hum of the air conditioner. "He's not vegetative," Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of the excitement Holloway expected. "He is depth-locked." Holloway scoffed. "The term appears in no medical textbook." Thorne explained the physics. At 30 atmospheres, the density of the air changes the mechanics of sound. The tympanic membrane, the eardrum, doesn't vibrate the same way. The brain recalibrates to process high-pressure acoustics. It filters out the low-density noise of the surface world as static. Vance wasn't brain-dead. His processing center was simply tuned to a frequency that didn't exist in this room. He was a radio receiver set to AM in an FM world. The twitch wasn't a reflex. It was the system latching on to the only vibration in the room that carried enough mechanical weight to register as a signal: the industrial hum of the HVAC. The conflict in the room shifted from medical to ideological. Holloway argued from the standpoint of biology. The neurons were silent. Thorne argued from the standpoint of engineering. The input was incompatible. He cited the Byford dolphin incident, not the gore, but the pressure differential. He explained that when a diver surfaces too fast, the issue isn't just the bends, it's the sudden loss of environmental density. The nervous system, calibrated to push back against the weight of the ocean, suddenly has nothing to push against. It over-torques and jams. "You have been whispering to a man who only hears thunder," Thorne stated. "You are trying to boot a high-pressure operating system in a vacuum." Holloway, protecting his department in the impending termination order, demanded evidence that could be measured by standard hospital equipment. He refused to accept a finger twitch synced to an air conditioner as proof of life. He gave Thorne a deadline. The extubation was scheduled. Thorne had 48 hours to prove that the silence in Vance's brain was a waiting period, not an end. The specialist didn't argue for compassion. He didn't argue for hope. He simply requested access to the accident logs and the facility's maintenance schematics. He needed to know the exact acoustic profile of the environment Vance had lost, because the only way to unlock the system was to rebuild the pressure, not with air, but with sound. To understand the mechanism of the failure, we must audit the environment Marcus Vance was engineered to inhabit. Saturation diving is not merely an occupation. It is a physiological alteration. At depths exceeding 300 meters, the human body is subjected to 30 atmospheres of pressure. To survive this crushing weight, the diver breathes a heliox mixture, helium and oxygen, because nitrogen becomes narcotic and toxic at that density. But the introduction of helium changes the fundamental physics of the habitat. Helium is 1/7 the density of air. Sound waves travel through it nearly 3 times faster than they do in a standard atmosphere. This creates a radical shift in the acoustic landscape. We are familiar with the Donald Duck effect, the high-pitched distortion of the voice caused by the speed of sound increasing the resonant frequency of the vocal tract. But the medical team at St. Jude's ignored the inverse equation, the distortion of hearing. In a heliox environment, the impedance mismatch between the gas and the eardrum is drastic. The auditory system adapts by creating an aggressive filter, a neurological gate that suppresses low-energy frequencies to prevent sensory overload from the constant, pressurized roar of the habitat's scrubbers and umbilicals. This is acoustic gating. The brain learns to ignore anything that doesn't carry the specific weight and velocity of a high-pressure sound wave. Thorne's hypothesis was built on this architectural logic. Vance's auditory cortex hadn't shut down due to damage. It had tightened its security parameters due to a lack of compatible input. The soft, polite murmurs of the doctors, the gentle beeping of the cardiac monitors, and the ambient hum of the hospital were falling below the threshold of his internal filter. To Vance's depth-calibrated brain, the hospital room wasn't filled with information. It was filled with dead air. He wasn't ignoring the world. The world was broadcasting on a frequency his system had marked as background static. He was waiting for the heavy, dense, high-velocity impact of sound waves moving through 30 atmospheres of pressure. Thorne validated this theory by pulling the accident logs from the rig. The event, classified as a catastrophe, was technically a rapid decompression of the transfer capsule. It wasn't a crash. It was a sudden, violent shift in density. The data indicated that Vance's vitals didn't crash because of blunt force trauma. They crashed because his autonomic nervous system engaged a preservation lock. When the pressure dropped instantly, the neural networks didn't have time to re-equilibrate to surface conditions. They acted like a computer pulled from a network during a firmware update. They froze in their last known configuration. Vance was biologically encrypted. His neurology was stuck in deep mode, waiting for the pressure to return before it would allow data processing to resume. The hospital was trying to hack a system that had pulled the plug on the network port. They were treating a software lock as a hardware failure. The solution, therefore, was not pharmacological. You cannot drug a system into changing its physics. The solution was acoustic. Thorne needed to construct a bottom sound. He didn't need to yell. He needed to replicate the specific acoustic signature of the saturation habitat. He needed to generate a frequency complex enough to bypass the gate, a sound that mimicked the density and velocity of the deep. He hypothesized that if the brainstem detected the specific harmonic resonance of a pressurized environment, it would disengage the lock, believing the diver had returned to a safe depth. The plan was forensic in its precision. Thorne intended to turn the sterile recovery room into a sonic simulation of the North Sea floor. He needed to feed the brain the one signal it trusted, the mechanical thrum of the life support system that had kept it alive for 20 years. The theory was mathematically sound. The physics checked out, but the execution faced a critical hardware limitation. The standard hospital speakers in the recovery room were designed for paging doctors and playing soft therapeutic music. They lacked the dynamic range to produce the infrasonic pressure required to simulate a 30-atmosphere environment. Thorne had the software code, the frequency, but he was trying to play it through a device that couldn't carry the weight of the signal. Thorne didn't wait for the ethics committee to stamp a piece of paper. In a system where the outcome is already designated as 0, adherence to protocol is merely a bureaucratic formality for the coroner. He waited for the shift change, the 15-minute window when the floor was in administrative flux. He bypassed the hospital's locked media inputs using a simple frequency bridge he'd rigged from a stripped-down radio receiver, patching directly into the bedside audio feed intended for calming classical music. He wasn't going to play Mozart. He was going to play the sound of survival machinery. He uploaded a looped audio file labeled heliox_scrub_cycle_B. To the uninitiated ear, the sound is repulsive. It is a jagged, high-frequency whine overlaid with a rhythmic, mechanical thumping. It is the sound of carbon dioxide scrubbers fighting to cleanse the air inside a pressurized bell, distorted by the thinness of helium. It sounds like a circular saw cutting through sheet metal 3 rooms away. When Thorne initiated the playback, the effect on the room was immediate and visceral. The nurse at the station 3 meters away flinched, instinctively reaching for the mute button, assuming a piece of life support equipment had thrown a bearing. To surface-dwelling biology, the sound registered as a warning signal, a mechanical distress call. "Turn it off," the charge nurse commanded, stepping into the room. "You're agitating the patient." On the surface, her assessment appeared correct. The room felt chaotic. The noise was sharp, intrusive, and technically aggressive. But Thorne blocked her path to the console, his eyes locked not on the staff, but on the telemetry monitor above the bed. He was looking for a specific forensic signature in the chaos. "Look at the rate," Thorne said. "Don't listen to the room. Look at the data." Standard medical logic dictates that a comatose patient subjected to loud, discordant noise should exhibit a stress response. The sympathetic nervous system, even in a vegetative state, often reacts to auditory aggression. You expect a spike in heart rate, a rise in blood pressure, an increase in intracranial tension. The monitor should have painted a picture of distress. It did the opposite. At the onset of the noise, Marcus Vance's heart rate was hovering at a jagged 95 beats per minute, a sign of chronic, low-level physiological panic. The moment the heliox scrub whine filled the air, the line dropped. It didn't crash, it descended. 95 became 80. 80 became 70. Within 30 seconds, the heart rate settled into a rhythmic, powerful 60 beats per minute. The blood pressure normalized. The erratic, shallow respiration deepened. The jagged peaks on the monitor smoothed into long, rolling waves. The room was filled with the screech of machinery, yet the patient was physically relaxing. "Parasympathetic engagement," Thorne noted, his voice cutting through the mechanical whine. "You've been keeping him in a quiet room, and his body interpreted it as a life support failure. In the deep, silence means the air has stopped moving. Silence means death. This noise? This noise tells his brain the pumps are running. He feels safe for the first time in 6 months." The attending neurologist, drawn in by the commotion, stared at the monitor with a mix of confusion and disdain. He saw the numbers, but he rejected the causality. To him, the drop in heart rate wasn't relaxation. It was a prelude to bradycardia. He interpreted the stabilization as a deepening of the coma, a negative reaction to sensory overload. He saw a patient shutting down, not a system booting up. "This is coincidence," the neurologist snapped, reaching past Thorne to sever the audio link. "You are inducing stress. The drop in rate is likely a vagal response to auditory trauma. You are hurting him." The moment the sound cut out, the monitor spiked. The jagged rhythm returned. The heart rate climbed back to 95. The peace vanished the second the silence returned. "That wasn't trauma," Thorne said, watching the stress lines return to the data stream. "That was maintenance." But the demonstration had failed to convince the institution. They saw a fluctuation caused by unauthorized tampering. Thorne realized that proving the hardware was listening wasn't enough. A reflex response to background noise could be dismissed as biological instinct. To stop the extubation, he needed more than a feeling of safety. He needed proof of higher cognitive function. He needed to prove that there was an operator inside the machine. He didn't just need to play a soundtrack. He needed to recreate the specific, complex acoustic profile of the day the accident happened. He needed to find the trigger that had locked the system down. The scrubbers proved the ears were working, but to reach the mind, he had to dig into the black box of the dive profile itself. He needed to verify the exact frequency of the failure. The administrative immune system of a teaching hospital is swift and absolute. Dr. Holloway did not view the stabilized heart rate data as a medical curiosity. He viewed it as an unauthorized variable introduced into a controlled palliative environment. The drop in Vance's pulse was dismissed in the official log as a stress-induced vagal clamp, a physiological recoil from auditory aggression rather than a moment of parasympathetic relief. The interpretation of data is always subject to the bias of the observer. Holloway saw a dying man being harassed by static. Thorne saw a system finally finding a carrier wave. But in the hierarchy of St. Jude's, the specialist's forensic intuition held no weight against the established protocols of the neurology department. The reprimand was delivered in Holloway's office, a space insulated from the mechanical realities of the ward by heavy oak doors and thick carpet. The conversation that followed was a collision of two distinct ethical frameworks. Holloway argued from the position of quality of life. He spoke of dignity, of the cruelty of prolonging a biological existence that possessed no cortical autonomy. He used terms like compassionate release and futility of care. To him, the ethical path was to allow the silence to win. Thorne's rebuttal was purely technical. He argued that dignity is a subjective social construct, whereas neural connectivity is a measurable physics problem. He posited that they weren't prolonging a vegetative state, they were failing to provide the necessary environmental parameters for consciousness. "You are looking for a soul," Thorne said, his voice devoid of emotion, focused entirely on the logic. "I am looking for a circuit. You cannot unplug the machine just because you don't know the password." Holloway didn't blink. He reached for a file on his desk, the accelerated timeline. Because of the disturbance caused by the unauthorized test, the hospital's risk management team had advised immediate resolution. The timeline for extubation was moved up. The window of 48 hours had evaporated. The procedure was scheduled for 0800 the following morning. Security was alerted to monitor Thorne's credentials. He was barred from physical contact with patient 304. He was effectively quarantined from the problem he was trying to solve. The system had decided that the risk of experimentation outweighed the negligible probability of recovery. Thorne was escorted to the elevator bank by hospital security. Standing in the corridor, cut off from the recovery room, he didn't leave immediately. He stood by the heavy fire doors, watching the digital floor indicator change, processing the failure of the previous test. The Heliox audio had stabilized the heart rate, but it hadn't triggered a wake-up event. Why? The frequency was correct, the modulation was accurate, but the delivery was flawed. The standard speakers moved air. They created sound waves that hit the eardrum. But in the deep, sound doesn't just hit the ear, it hits the chest. It hits the bone. At 30 atmospheres, sound is a physical force. It has mass. The speakers were broadcasting the message, but they lacked the pressure to deliver it. He needed to turn the air into a solid. As he stood there, the building's central climate control system shifted gears. The floor beneath his feet gave a subtle, rhythmic shudder. It was the heavy industrial vibration of the primary chillers kicking in on the roof, 6 floors up. Thorne felt the vibration travel up through the soles of his boots and resonate in his shin bones. He stopped. He recalled the moment in the room, the finger twitch. It hadn't happened when he spoke. It hadn't happened when the nurse dropped a tray. It happened when the HVAC cycled. The realization hit him with the clarity of a mathematical proof. Marcus Vance didn't need to hear the frequency. He needed to feel it. The audit of the accident proved that the decompression froze his nervous system. To unlock it, the stimulus had to bypass the ear and resonate the skeleton itself. The hospital room's speakers were toys. They could never generate the infrasonic vibration required to mimic the crushing weight of the sea. But the building was a machine. It had generators, compressors, and massive ventilation shafts that ran like arteries directly into the recovery rooms. Thorne realized his mistake. He had been trying to use medical equipment to solve an industrial problem. He didn't need permission to access the patient's bedside anymore. He needed access to the hospital's lungs. The security team watched him walk away, assuming he was leaving the premises. He wasn't. He was heading for the service elevators. If the doctors wouldn't let him shout, he would make the walls speak. The basement of St. Jude's Medical Center operates on a different set of laws than the sterile wards above. Upstairs, the priority is biological preservation. Down here, the priority is mechanical continuity. Thorne found a secluded network node behind the laundry processing unit, a forgotten terminal used for monitoring the facility's energy consumption. He didn't need patient records anymore. He needed the blueprints of the machine itself. He needed to understand the hospital not as a place of healing, but as a complex arrangement of steel beams, concrete slabs, and hollow ventilation shafts. He was looking for a way to turn a standard recovery room into a resonance chamber. He pulled up the acoustic spectrogram of the accident site again. The data from the dive support vessel was specific. When the decompression event occurred, the pumps on the rig were running at a specific cadence. The rapid pressure drop had created a water hammer effect in the hydraulic lines, a rhythmic, percussive thumping at exactly 42 hertz. This was the frequency of the trauma. It was the last structured signal Marcus Vance's brain had processed before the lock engaged. Thorne hypothesized that this specific frequency acted as the carrier wave for the diver's reality. To bring him back, Thorne didn't just need to make noise. He needed to replicate that exact 42 hertz thrum with sufficient physical force to vibrate the sternum. Thorne overlaid this 42 hertz target against the operational frequencies of the hospital's infrastructure. He scanned the schematics of the HVAC chillers. Too fast, they hummed at a high pitch 120 hertz. He checked the elevator winches, too variable. Then he found the match in the auxiliary power grid. The hospital's backup generator, a massive diesel unit housed in the sub-basement, ran a weekly test cycle. At idle, the massive pistons of the generator fired at a rhythm that produced a primary harmonic resonance of exactly 42 hertz. It was a dirty, heavy, industrial vibration, the exact acoustic twin of the rig's hydraulic pumps. The generator was the instrument. The ventilation system was the amplifier. The plan formed in the geometry of the ductwork. Room 304 was fed by a primary supply trunk that ran directly from the sub-basement vertical shaft. If Thorne could engage the backup generator and simultaneously manipulate the dampers in the ventilation shaft, he could create a standing wave. He wouldn't just be blowing air. He would be channeling the physical vibration of the diesel engine directly into the room. The metal ductwork would act as a waveguide, carrying the heavy, percussive 42 hertz signal up 6 floors and dumping it into the recovery room. It would turn the entire room into the inside of a guitar body. The walls would vibrate. The floor would hum. The air itself would feel heavy. But the risk calculation was severe. The hospital's building management system, BMS, had safety protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of resonance. If the vibration inside the ducts hit the natural frequency of the sheet metal, the ducts wouldn't just rattle, they could collapse. A standing wave of that intensity could shatter the observation windows or blow the diffusers out of the ceiling. Thorne wasn't just planning to play a sound. He was planning to weaponize the building's airflow. He had to bypass the safety limiters on the damper controls to allow the vibration to pass through unchecked. He was effectively removing the shock absorbers from the building's lungs. He needed an interface. He couldn't control the generator from the laundry terminal. That system was hardwired. He needed to physically bridge the control circuit on the generator itself to the damper actuators. He began to scavenge. He raided a maintenance locker, securing a handful of contact microphones, a spool of copper wire, and a high-voltage testing unit. He stripped the casing off a portable frequency analyzer. He wasn't building a medical device. He was building a shaker, a crude localized transmitter that would allow him to sync the generator's firing order with the opening and closing of the air vents. The engineering challenge was timing. He had to manually trigger the generator to start, then override the automatic transfer switch so it wouldn't actually feed power to the grid. It just needed to run. Then he had to jam the dampers open. It was a delicate sequence of industrial sabotage. If he failed, the generator would trip its breakers and the hospital would go dark. If he succeeded, he would fill room 304 with the ghost of the deep sea. He had the frequency. He had the method. Now, he just needed a way to get into the main mechanical room without triggering the silent alarms. He checked the maintenance schedule. The shift change for the physical plant security was in 10 minutes. That was his window. He gathered his wire and his tools. The theory was sound, but the execution required him to be a ghost in the machine. Access to the mechanical heart of a hospital is theoretically restricted, but in practice, it is protected only by the assumption of compliance. Thorne knew that security protocols are designed to identify threats based on speed and aggression. They look for running figures, shouted demands, and visible weapons. They do not look for a man in coveralls holding a clipboard and a multimeter, walking with the weary, irritated cadence of a technician working mandatory overtime. He didn't sneak past the security checkpoint at the entrance to the physical plant. He walked directly up to it. The guard, a private contractor paid to watch monitors rather than understand infrastructure, stepped forward to block the path. Thorne didn't wait for the question. He projected the boredom of a man executing a bureaucratic checklist. He cited Code 14B, a fictitious regulatory mandate regarding the calibration of particulate sensors in the HVAC return lines. He explained, using dense, jargon-heavy syntax, that the biohazard filters were showing a drift in their pressure differential, and that if he didn't manually reset the sensors in the sub-basement, the entire surgical wing would fail its morning air quality audit. He held up the stripped-down frequency analyzer as if it were a standard calibration tool. The guard, faced with the choice of detaining a specialist and potentially shutting down the OR or simply swiping a badge, chose the path of least resistance. The magnetic lock clicked open. Thorne was inside the service corridor. The air here was different, warmer, smelling of oil and ozone. He moved quickly now, shedding the lethargy of the ruse. He located the access hatch for the primary ventilation shaft feeding the third floor. It was a tight squeeze, a narrow crawl space lined with fiberglass insulation and bundles of fiber optic cable. He pulled himself up into the plenum, the crawl space above the drop ceiling, moving parallel to the main air trunk. He wasn't just looking for a vent. He was looking for the mixing box, the point where the high-velocity air from the basement slowed down before entering the patient rooms. This was the critical junction. He unpacked the contact microphones he had scavenged. In their original function, these devices were designed to listen to engine bearings for faults. Thorne reversed their polarity in his circuit loop. Instead of listening, they would drive. He taped the transducers directly onto the sheet metal of the mixing box, using the ductwork itself as a massive diaphragm. He wasn't installing a speaker. He was turning the building's ventilation system into a localized earthquake generator. He wired them in series, running the copper leads back toward the service ladder that dropped down into the generator room. Below him, the security dynamic shifted. The guard at the desk had likely logged the entry, but the building management system had flagged an anomaly. Thorne had forced a damper open manually to attach the sensors. The system registered this as a mechanical fault, Zone 3. A maintenance team was dispatched, not to arrest an intruder, but to fix a broken vent. But when they arrived at the access hatch and found the lock drilled out, the call went up to security. The passive monitoring phase was over. The hunt had begun. Thorne could hear the heavy boots of the response team echoing on the metal grating of the catwalks 2 floors above. He dropped down the ladder into the generator room. The space was cavernous, dominated by the massive Caterpillar diesel engine block that served as the hospital's emergency heart. It was silent, a sleeping giant of cast iron and pistons. Thorne moved to the control panel. He didn't have the keys to the ignition sequence, but he didn't need them. He pulled the cover off the transfer switch. Using his laptop, he jacked directly into the diagnostic port of the generator's electronic control module, ECM. He wasn't hacking a password. He was injecting a false signal. He wrote a quick script to tell the generator's computer that the main grid voltage had dropped to 0. He was tricking the machine into believing the hospital had lost power. The ECM's logic was hard-coded. If main power fails, start the engine immediately. He monitored the upload bar on his screen. 90%. 95%. The door to the generator room rattled. It was locked from the inside, but the handle turned violently. Voices shouted orders from the corridor. They knew he was in there. Thorne didn't look at the door. He looked at the frequency readout on his laptop. He had the transducers on the ducts wired to the generator's output frequency. He was ready to couple the mechanical vibration of the engine to the air in Marcus Vance's room. "Open the door!" The command was muffled by the steel. Thorne hit the execute key. The laptop sent the fault signal. The starter motor on the diesel engine engaged with a screech of high-torque electricity. The machine didn't just start, it exploded into life. The room instantly filled with the deafening, chest-compressing roar of a 12-cylinder industrial engine. The vibration was absolute. Thorne checked the monitor. The engine settled into its idle rhythm. The harmonics aligned. 42 hertz. He wasn't broadcasting music. He was broadcasting raw power. The test had begun. The breach of the sub-basement generator room was not a negotiation. It was a kinetic event. The security team, realizing the magnitude of the unauthorized activation, utilized a battering ram against the fire-rated steel door. The impact shuddered through the frame, buckling the hinges and sending a metallic scream cutting through the roar of the diesel engine. Inside, Dr. Thorne did not turn to face the intrusion. He had wedged a heavy tool chest against the door handle to buy himself seconds, not minutes. His attention was entirely consumed by the waveform monitor on his laptop. The screen displayed a single, perfect sine wave, holding steady at 42 hertz. The amplitude was climbing into the red zone. The generator wasn't just running, it was driving the hospital's ventilation shafts like a massive cast-iron piston. Thorne initiated the Heliox protocol. This was not a broadcast of recorded sound. It was the generation of a standing wave. By syncing the firing order of the 12-cylinder engine with the open dampers of the HVAC system, he was turning the ductwork into a pneumatic waveguide. The vibration traveled up the steel risers, bypassing the acoustic dampeners designed for airflow, not structural resonance. The physics of the building began to shift. The concrete floor of the basement acted as a soundboard, transmitting the low-frequency energy directly into the steel skeleton of the facility. The hospital was no longer a static structure. It was a vibrating diaphragm. On the third floor, the effect was immediate and terrifying. The air in room 304 didn't just carry noise, it thickened with pressure. The 42 hertz signal hit the room with the weight of a physical object. The acoustic ceiling tiles began to dance in their grids, dusting the sterile floor with white powder. The infusion pumps clamped to the bedside rails rattled violently, their internal accelerometers triggering error codes that flashed in sync with the thrumming beat. To the medical staff, this wasn't an auditory experience, it was a structural failure. The sensation was omnidirectional. It rattled the teeth in their skulls and blurred their vision as the fluid in their eyes vibrated in sympathy with the room. Dr. Holloway, who had been standing over the patient to finalize the extubation order, grabbed the bedrail for balance. He didn't assume sabotage. He assumed the foundation was cracking. He shouted orders to evacuate, but his voice was swallowed by the heavy, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The nurses covered their ears, a futile gesture against a sound that was conducting through the floor and into their skeletal structures. The monitors flickered as the vibration interfered with the sensitive piezoelectric sensors. The room was dissolving into chaos, a sterile environment violently introduced to the chaotic energy of an industrial machine. But in the center of the panic, the variable remained constant. Marcus Vance's body was no longer a passive object. The 42 Hz signal bypassed his ears entirely. It conducted through the metal frame of the hospital bed, traveled through the mattress, and resonated directly into his thoracic cavity. To a normal human, this frequency induces nausea and dread, the so-called fear frequency. But to a saturation diver, this specific vibration is the signature of life. It is the feeling of the habitat pressurizing. It is the feeling of the umbilical pumps cycling. The depth lock on his neurology, the mechanism that had frozen his pathways to prevent decompression damage, detected the return of the pressure wave. The biological sensors read the vibration as depth. The brainstem, which had been holding the system in a protective stasis, received the kinetic code it had been waiting for. The external pressure now matched the internal expectation. The threat of the surface was gone. The safety of the deep had returned. Holloway, realizing the vibration was emanating from the ventilation registers, connected the chaos to the specialist. He didn't call security. He called facility management on his emergency radio. He screamed for a total power kill. He didn't want a shutdown sequence. He demanded a hard cut. The facility manager, recognizing the risk of the generators shaking the ductwork apart, bypassed the safety interlocks and pulled the main breaker for the critical care wing. The result was instantaneous. The lights died. The ventilators switched to battery backup with a synchronized, high-pitched beep. The hum of the HVAC vanished. In the basement, the generator, cut off from its control loop, sputtered and seized. The silence that returned to room 304 was absolute. It was heavy, ringing, and profound. The chaos evaporated, leaving the room in the dim blue wash of the emergency backup lighting. But the momentum had already shifted. The kinetic energy had been delivered. The system had been rebooted, and in the sudden quiet, the echo of the deep sea still hung in the air. The silence that followed the power cut was not peace. It was the breathless vacuum of a system in shock. For 3 seconds, the recovery room existed in the dim slate blue wash of the emergency battery packs. The monitors were black. The ventilator bellows had paused, waiting for their internal capacitors to discharge. In this gap, Dr. Holloway believed he had won. He believed he had severed the connection between the rogue specialist and the hospital's infrastructure. He had silenced the noise. But in his haste to restore order, Holloway had forgotten the fundamental architecture of the building he commanded. He had forgotten that a hospital is designed never to die. By manually tripping the main breaker for the critical care wing, Holloway had simulated a catastrophic grid failure. The building management system, detecting the total loss of voltage on the primary bus, did exactly what it was programmed to do. It didn't ask for permission. It executed the survival protocol. In the sub-basement, the automatic transfer switch, ATS, slammed over with a percussive crack like a gunshot. The diesel generator, which had sputtered when Thorne's laptop link was severed, was instantly seized by the facility's hard-coded logic. It was no longer running a test script. It was now the sole power source for the entire wing. The engine roared back to life, but this time, the physics were different. Before, under Thorne's hack, the generator was spinning freely, an unloaded engine vibrating with potential but lacking weight. Now it was under load. It was shouldering the electrical burden of lights, pumps, elevators, and HVAC fans. The physics of a diesel engine under maximum torque creates a specific, bone-rattling harmonic that an idling engine cannot replicate. As the massive pistons fought to push electricity into the dead grid, the RPMs settled into a heavy, grinding cadence. The frequency didn't drift. It locked. The heavy iron block of the generator sat on its mounts and hammered the foundation of St. Jude's with a frequency that was no longer 42 Hz by approximation, but 42 Hz by sheer mechanical necessity. This was Thorne's trap. He knew he couldn't simulate the crushing weight of the ocean with a laptop. He needed the resistance of the entire building. He had baited the administration into cutting the power, knowing that the reboot would generate the heavy air acoustic signature required to trick the brainstem. The vibration returned to room 304, but it was deeper now. It wasn't shaking the ceiling tiles. It was pressurizing the air. It felt thick, viscous, and undeniable. The blue emergency lights flickered as the generator took the load, casting stroboscopic shadows across the bed. And in that chaotic, high-contrast lighting, the variable changed. Marcus Vance's hand, which had been resting in a state of flaccid paralysis for 180 days, did not spasm. A spasm is a firing of random motor neurons, a clawing, chaotic contraction. This was geometry. The thumb extended, the index finger curled to meet it. The three remaining fingers straightened and splayed with deliberate tension. It was the OK sign. In the civilian world, this is a casual gesture. In the saturation diving manual, it is the primary survival signal. It means I am pressurized, I am stable, I am here. Thorne saw it before the security guards grabbed him. They had breached the room, their hands on his shoulders, hauling him back from the window. He didn't fight the restraint. He didn't look at Holloway. He screamed a single technical directive, his voice cracking over the roar of the returning ventilation. "Look at the opposition! That is not a reflex! Check the hand!" Holloway ignored him, focused on the monitors rebooting. But the charge nurse, the one who had mocked the initial static, stopped. She was standing at the foot of the bed, her hand resting on the rail to steady herself against the vibration. She saw the silhouette of the hand against the blue light. The anatomy of the gesture was impossible to dismiss. To form that circle requires the complex coordination of the opponent's pollicis muscle and the flexor digitorum. It requires a cortical command loop. A vegetable cannot make a circle. A vegetable can only make a fist. She moved to the side of the bed. The vibration in the room was intense, a physical thrumming that made her teeth ache. She reached out and took Vance's hand. It was warm. The skin was dry, but the tension in the fingers was rigid. It was the grip of a man holding onto a lifeline. "Mr. Vance?" she whispered, the words lost in the mechanical roar. She switched to the tactile protocol. She squeezed his hand once. "If you can hear me, squeeze back." Nothing happened. The hand remained locked in the OK posture. Holloway, seeing the nurse's hesitation, stepped forward. "Nurse, step away. The patient is seizing. We need to sedate." "Wait," she said. She didn't let go. She looked at Thorne, who was being dragged through the double doors. Thorne shouted one last code before the doors swung shut. "He's not listening for English. He's listening for the bell. Give him the code." The nurse looked back at the patient. She didn't know the bell codes, but she knew the rhythm of the squeeze. She squeezed again, hard, rhythmic, urgent. Squeeze, 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 squeeze. 4 distinct pulses. Vance's hand collapsed from the OK sign. For a second, it went limp. Then, with the slow, hydraulic precision of a machine coming online, his fingers tightened around hers. He didn't just squeeze, he pulsed. Short, short, long. Pause. Short, long, long, short. The nurse stared at her hand, feeling the articulation of the fingers. She looked up at Holloway, her face drained of color. "That's not a seizure, doctor." "It's a spasm," Holloway insisted, reaching for the sedative vial. "No," she said, her voice rising, finding the authority of the witness. "It's a pattern. He's repeating it. Short, short, long." "You," she translated, her mind racing back to basic training. "Short, long, long, short." "P," she whispered. "Up." The room seemed to tilt. The generator continued to hammer its 42 Hz rhythm into the floorboards, the acoustic life support system keeping the connection open. The patient wasn't waking up in a hospital. In his mind, he was signaling the dive supervisor to pull the cage. He was asking to ascend. He was asking to come home. The data was absolute. The flat line was a lie. The specialist had been right. The building was the cure. The generator in the sub-basement continued to hammer against the foundation of the hospital. Dr. Holloway stood by the emergency cutoff switch, his hand hovering over the red plastic guard, but he did not strike it. The room was no longer under his command. The nurse, a woman whose previous role had been defined by changing IV bags and logging urine output, had effectively seized control of the environment. She held Marcus Vance's hand with a grip that was less clinical and more industrial, acting as a human conduit for the vibration filling the room. She wasn't watching the doctors. She was watching the rhythm of the fingers. On the telemetry monitors above the bed, the flat line that had defined case 304 for 6 months began to fracture. It didn't spike into the chaotic, jagged peaks of a seizure, as Holloway had predicted. Instead, the line began to undulate. It rose and fell in a slow, deliberate cadence that perfectly matched the 42 hertz thrum of the diesel engine downstairs. The brain was not generating its own electricity yet. It was drafting behind the mechanical signal. The heavy, percussive acoustic wave was acting as an external pacemaker for the cortex. The neurons, previously dormant and scattered, were being forced into alignment by the sheer physical pressure of the sound. The attending neurologist, who had arrived with the security team, pushed past the stunned guards to examine the readout. He didn't look for signs of life. He looked for signs of artifacting. In standard neurology, if a brain wave matches an external electrical source, it is dismissed as interference. 60 cycle hum from a bad ground wire. But this wasn't 60 cycles. It was 42. And the wave wasn't uniform. It had texture. Embedded within the primary carrier wave were smaller, faster oscillations, gamma bursts. These are the forensic signature of high-level information processing. The brain wasn't just vibrating, it was thinking. Thorne, currently handcuffed to a chair in the adjacent security office, provided the explanation to the facility director and 2 police officers. He spoke with the fatigue of a mechanic who has just finished a 16-hour transmission rebuild. He didn't use medical terminology. He used the language of encryption. He explained acoustic keying. The human brain, he argued, is an adaptive operating system. When Vance's physiology locked down during the accident, it created a BIOS, a basic input/output system that required a specific password to unlock. The password wasn't a drug. It wasn't a word. It was an environmental state. The hospital had been typing the wrong code for half a year. Thorne had simply reset the server environment to match the user's last known configuration. Back in the room, the validation was absolute. The neurologist conducted a modified consciousness test. He didn't ask Vance to open his eyes. The cranial nerves controlling the eyelids were still paralyzed by the sheer weight of the metabolic dormancy. Instead, he asked for the code. If you are receiving, confirm depth. The nurse felt the squeeze. Short. Short. Long. The neurologist checked the dive tables on his tablet, a document he had never needed before today. The code corresponded to bottom stable. The patient was conscious. He was trapped inside a paralyzed shell, locked in a dark room. But he was no longer alone. He was communicating through the only interface that remained open, the pressure modulation of his grip. The narrative shift within the hospital administration was instantaneous and seamless. The moment the neurologist confirmed cognitive function, the rogue event was reclassified. Dr. Holloway, realizing that the termination of care for a conscious patient would constitute homicide, pivoted. The security team was ordered to stand down. The generator was not shut off. It was monitored. The narrative of the madman in the basement was scrubbed from the immediate log. In its place, the administration began to draft a press release regarding a, quote, breakthrough in multimodal sensory stimulation therapy. They claimed the success. The hospital's PR department began framing the event as a high-risk, high-reward intervention that had been, quote, in development within the neurology wing. Thorne was not mentioned as the architect. He was painted as a consulting technician who had assisted in the hardware implementation. The institution absorbed the anomaly. They took the chaotic, dangerous truth of the physics and sanitized it into a medical miracle they could bill for. They didn't care about the frequency. They cared about the outcome. Thorne watched the activity through the glass of the security office. He saw the doctors swarming the bed, taking notes, adjusting the very machines he had bypassed. He saw Holloway giving orders with renewed confidence, acting as if the 42 hertz vibration was his prescription. A younger man might have been furious at the theft of credit. Thorne felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a balanced equation. He didn't care whose name was on the paper. He cared that the system worked. The logic held. The pressure was equalized. The diver was back on the line. That was the only metric that mattered. The patient was back, therefore the specialist's work was done. The exit protocol for a specialist who has just saved a life by nearly destroying a building is not a handshake. It is a liability waiver and a security escort to the curb. Dr. Elias Thorne was not debriefed by the medical board. He was processed by the legal department. They confiscated his hard drives. They scrubbed the unauthorized software from the facility's servers. They issued a permanent trespass warning for St. Jude's Medical Center, effective immediately. He stood on the sidewalk, the cold air of the street hitting his face, watching the automatic doors slide shut. He was back in the uncontrolled variable of the city. Inside the lobby, visible through the glass, a monitor displayed the local news feed. The chyron read, "Medical miracle at St. Jude's. Coma patient wakens." The reporter spoke of groundbreaking sensory stimulation therapy, pioneered by Dr. Eris Halloway and the neurology department. There was no mention of the diesel generator. There was no mention of the unauthorized frequency or the structural resonance that had cracked the drywall in the East Wing. The narrative had been sanitized. The Heliox protocol had been rebranded as a proprietary hospital treatment, a safe, controlled intervention, rather than a desperate industrial hack. Thorne watched the broadcast without bitterness. In forensic engineering, the technician is never the story. The failure analysis is the story. He had not come to be a hero. He had come to fix a broken circuit. The institution required the credit to maintain its funding and its reputation. Thorne required only the data. He pulled his phone from his pocket and checked the final data packet he had mirrored before the laptop was seized. The graph was clean. The moment the generator hit 42 Hz, the depth lock on Marcus Vance's brainstem had dissolved. The neurological pressure had equalized. The data proved that the human mind is not just a biological computer, but a resonant structure that requires specific environmental keys to function. He had lost his chance at reinstatement. The medical board would never license a man who hijacked a hospital's power grid and overrode the safety limiters on a Class A facility. His career in standard medicine was effectively terminated. But the theorem was proven. The math worked. That was the only currency that mattered in the deep. He had traded his professional standing for a single data point. The human brain can be rebooted if you understand the physics of its crash. Marcus Vance would never return to the saturation line. The nitrogen damage to his joints and the atrophy of his muscles meant his career as a diver was over. He would live the rest of his life at one atmosphere, a surface dweller, restricted to the shallow end of the pressure gradient. But he was present. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was a conscious observer, able to squeeze a hand, able to signal OK. The system had been patched. The cost of the repair was the specialist's career, but the vessel was salvageable. Thorne turned away from the glass facade of the hospital. He walked into the dense, chaotic noise of the downtown traffic. He didn't hear the cars as vehicles. He heard them as frequencies. He heard the 60-cycle hum of the streetlights. He heard the low-frequency rumble of the subway beneath the grate. He heard the mechanical truth of the world, a symphony of vibrations that most people ignore. He was alone, unfunded, and professionally exiled, but he was right, and in the silence of his own mind, that was enough volume. Institutions are built to follow protocols. Specialists are built to follow physics. When the two collide, the paperwork always condemns the method, even if the patient survives the result. The system calls it malpractice. The data calls it a successful reboot. If you want to see more case files where technical truth overrides medical dogma, subscribe to the channel. The signal is clear.